So now seeing the situation turn against him, Kasumoto Hosokawa decided to purge the court of all of Tomiko's supporters and her sons. So he also kidnapped the emperor and moved them behind his own battle lines to prevent Yamana from doing it and being able to claim imperial authority. In late September, the Western Army attacked Sambo-in, a monastic building next to the palace of the emperor. And by next, I mean not like you and your neighbor if you live in a house. Like, it could have been like a mile away, but it was still considered next door. So this was probably the largest battle of the Onin War. 50,000 men from the western camp attacked and destroyed it and took control of the imperial palace. The Eastern Army called for aid from the neighboring Shugo, from the neighboring clans and neighboring governors. And the Akamatsu clan sent their army. And the Akamatsu clan, when they got there, they did the same thing that the Ouchi did. They fought their way through the western camp's battle lines to get to the eastern camp. Which again means that not much resistance was being put up, because that could have very easily have turned into an all-out battle that would have decided the war right there. However, this was not enough to stop the Western Army's momentum. By October, the Eastern Army had been pushed to a handful of buildings in the corner of Kyoto. So they had been pushed out of most of the city. They still controlled the Shokokuji Monastery, the shogunate buildings, the administrative buildings, and Hosokawa's personal mansion, which is where their headquarters was at. By now, the city was mostly ruins, and bigger battles started to take place. Less skirmishing, less door-to-door, since there was no door-to-doors to fight. There were no houses to go into. Most of the city lay in ruins, so now battle lines were beginning to be formed and there were major skirmishes. The Western Army then decided to retake Shokokuji, and they stormed it by bribing a monk who set fire to the temple while the Western Army was attacking. And the monastery fell and the Eastern Army was pushed back even further out of Kyoto. By the end of the day, the Onin Ki, which is the official historical record of the time, states that the Ouchi clan alone collected 8 cartloads of heads that were deemed important enough to store. So samurai would go on headhunts after a battle, usually during. But this in big battles like this would be restrictive. So any enemy you defeat, then you would go and cut their head off and present it to your lord. And you would be paid, you would be rewarded for this. So it is said that the Ouchi samurai collected 8 cartloads, and by cartloads, imagine not wheelbarrows, they're talking about things that are pulled by ox. There were so many heads that there was no place to put them, so they filled up a ditch that was hundreds of feet long and many feet wide. So there was at least thousands of dead. So legend states that the ladies of the shogunate, so the shogun's concubines and the ladies who were the wives of the men who worked there, feared that there would be a mass rape if the Western Army took their position. And they pleaded with the shogun Yoshimasa to send all of the women out of the city. And again, the legend states that Yoshimasa just looked at them, ignored them, and returned to his drinking party, which he was throwing that night, which is something that was written by Stephen Turnbull in A History of Japan, 1334 to 1615. By the end of 1467, 5 months after the war began, the capital, Kyoto, for centuries the capital of Japan, and the home of the emperor for at least 1,000 years, was devastated. Buildings that were hundreds and hundreds of years old were no longer there, and it was really a tragedy, even at the time. So the Hosokawa launched an attack soon after and retook the ruins of Shokokuji, because this was what it came down to, fighting over ruins. The Western Army made no effort to counterattack, and then the year ended with inactivity. It is said that the Eastern Army controlled only one of the entries into the city, and that their position looked grim at the time. So they controlled a road that led to the Sanindo Highway. So on the first day of the new year, 1468, Katsumoto ordered an all-out offensive that took the Western Army by surprise. Fierce fighting began, but the results were inconclusive, and both sides withdrew to their own camps and remained inactive until April. The war then became bogged down. The only fighting were raids, so supply raids, skirmishes, and both sides began to fortify their position for months. And just fortifying and fortifying. In September, some fighting broke out in some important monasteries. One of them was the Tenryuji, which was destroyed along with a mansion, a very important mansion of the Kiyowara family, which was famous for its library. It had an amazing library with hundreds and hundreds of scrolls that were hundreds of years old, and just like the Library of Alexandria, gone in a snap of a finger. So by 1468, now the fighting had begun to move out into the provinces. The main fighting in Kyoto was a political fight. In 1469, Yoshimasa named his son, by Tomiko Yoshihisa, his heir. And Yoshimi, by some unforeseen event, became one of Yamana's leading generals. So the man who kidnapped him at the beginning of the war, he was now a general for. And Yoshimi was declared a rebel and stripped of all rank by the emperor, who was also tired of this war and wanted it to end. In 1471, after a couple years of inactivity, a peculiar incident occurred in which Sozen Yamana brought someone who looked like the relative of an emperor, and he wanted to start basically a revolution and overthrow the emperor as well as the sitting shogun. But Yoshimi voiced his displeasure, and nothing else is known about that after this. By 1473, most of the clans from both sides began to return to their own provinces and withdraw their armies. The East and Western army were depleted, demoralized. Years had gone on since the start of the war. Years and years and years, almost 6 years, and nothing had been accomplished except for destroying Kyoto. So now both sides wished for peace. Katsumoto said that he would enter monastery life, so become a monk, and Sozen was willing to commit seppuku, to kill himself. That, however, became unnecessary when they both died that same year, one after the other, very shortly, within months. Sozen was 70 and Katsumoto was 43. That same year, Yoshimasa retired, and his son Yoshihisa became shogun. So the new shogun Yoshihisa, now worried that with the death of Katsumoto, the eastern army would be weakened and give room for Ouchi, who had assumed control of the western army, to take charge. So the fighting was now in the provinces, mostly in Yamato, which was the province where Kyoto was at. The Hakatayama clan were still under civil war, the Shiba clan were still under civil war. In 1475, Ouchi helped end the Hakatayama civil war, and it took a couple more years for both of the armies to fully disband. On December 17th, 1477, Ouchi himself submitted to the new shogun Yoshihisa, and that officially ended the war. But before he left, Masahiro burnt down the shogun's home to show him that he was still a threat and he should not be messed with. But peace did not come to Japan with the end of the war. In Kanto, the branch of the Ashikaga family, which had been the Kanto Kanrei, or the deputy shoguns in the Kanto region, were still fighting the Uesugi family. In Kyushu, the great clans were fighting each other. You had Shimazu, Ito, Hyuga, Tachibana, Otomo, and Ouchi all fighting for control of the island of Kyushu, which was the second most important and second largest island in Japan at the time, because Hokkaido was still not colonized. So the Onin War officially ended in 1477, and it accomplished nothing except killing tens of thousands of people and causing tens of thousands of peasants to die from famine. Yoshihisa, who was the casus belli for the war when he was born, became shogun at 8 years old. He tried to rein in the daimyo as he got older, and he was actually killed in battle at the age of 23, so not long after he achieved adulthood, by the Rakaku clan, who were seizing his properties and his lands in southern Oumi. He was succeeded by Yoshitane, the son of his uncle Yoshimi, who was the rebel that was fighting against his father. It all gets very confusing. So Yoshitane was born in 1466 and was made shogun in 1490, which did not end well. He was then overthrown, and in 1493 he became shogun again. He was overthrown in 1490 by Masamoto Hosokawa, who replaced him with Yoshizumi Ashikaga, who became the 11th shogun. So Masamoto was the son of Katsumoto and the new head of the Hosokawa family once his father died, and he had aspirations to become powerful more than his father. He fought a war with the Hakatayama clan and purged many of the people in his clan who did not agree with him. And in 1507, the Miyoshi clan, which were one of his vassals along with some other clans, plotted and had him killed. Yoshitane, who was still at this time deposed, so he has still not come to his second reign as shogun, fled and sought refuge with guess who? With Masahiro's son, Yoshiyuki Ouchi, who had been busy since the death of his father expanding the Ouchi clan and making them the most powerful clan in Japan at that time. He fought the Otomo, the Shoni, and the Yamana in Kyushu and in the Chugoku region. So by 1500, they were singularly the most powerful clan in Japan. After the assassination of Masamoto in 1507, Ouchi marched and restored Yoshitane as shogun. Yoshioki remained in the capital until 1518, defending the shogun. So he was a man of true loyalty. He thought that the war that had come, the Onin War, was something that should never be repeated, but he knew that the shogun had no power. So he stayed in Kyoto with his large army to deter anyone who would try and use the shogun for their own purposes. After the death of Masamoto, the Hosokawa clan fell from grace for a while as his two adopted sons, Takakumi and Sumimoto, fought a civil war for control. So the devastation that the Onin War caused was more significant to common people. During this time, peasants started to form ikis, militias, to protect themselves. Peasants, minor lords, minor nobles, minor landholders, yisamurai, which were samurai that didn't have much land or didn't serve vast lords, daimyo, shogun, stuff like that, all banded together, and the Iko-iki became the most prominent of these groups, even though there were many of the different ikis, which were rebellions that sought to overthrow the ruling shugos, so the ruling governors. In order to fund these militias, the ikis would attack very rich people, not necessarily nobles, because that would have, that would not be good. An army would be sent. But artisans, merchants, and people like that. Their first leader was Renyo, who was a pacifist and advocated for peace, always. Renyo was born in 1415, the son of the 7th abbot of the Honganji temple. In 1457, he became the 8th head priest of that temple. He spread his teachings for decades and became very popular with the peasants. In 1465, Mount Hei sent warrior monks. Mount Hei is a very important temple, which we will learn about much more later once we get to Lord Nobunaga. And they destroyed most of the Honganji temple and carried away some of their money, but Renyo had already hidden most of it, so he was able to pay for peace. Once the Onin War started, it gave him the chance he was looking for. And by his death in 1499, the Ishiyama Honganji, as it was now known, the temple, was as powerful and as rich as most warlords in Japan. That even so that in 1486 they were able to take over a whole province, the province of Kaga in the north of Japan. And they would rule this province for over a century until Nobunaga kicks them out in the 1580s. And thank you all for listening. This was the Sengoku Jidai, episode 1.